and welcome to another episode of Let's Argue About Plants, the podcast for people who love plants, but not always the same ones. It's the first week of March, and the fine gardening staff is at the Philadelphia Flower and Garden Show this week. And so while we're away, I thought it would be fun to share some favorite moments from interview episodes that we've been recording over the past year. So I'm going to dive right into it. The first interview that I wanted to touch on is actually the first interview in the series, and that was with Stacie Crooks. Stacie is a good friend of Fine Gardening Magazine. She's a Seattle-based garden designer. She has been designing gardens actually all over the Pacific Northwest and has written about a dozen articles for Fine Gardening over the years. And I was surprised to learn that this amazing designer is self-taught. So here's how Stacie describes how she first got her foothold in the world of horticulture and garden design.
Okay, well, I didn't start until I was around 40, and I volunteered at the Bellevue Botanical Garden because I loved gardening, but I knew nothing about it. And I learned how to be a docent, and I learned a lot of different plant names, and they tested you. You had to learn all the plant names there. Very diverse garden. It's a large garden. And then the Dunn Garden, the historic Dunn Garden, which was designed by the Olmsteds, opened up here near where I live. And I had a baby in a backpack, and I went over there and I said, I'll volunteer, give me something to do. And they said, well, can you set up an education program? So I thought, well, this would be a good challenge. And I'd just been through the docent program at the Bellevue Botanical Garden. So I sort of had an idea how to set one up. So I ended up on the board there for about 10 years. And people started coming and taking me home with them, saying, can you come home and help me in my garden? You know a lot about large landscapes. I fell in love with the large landscapes there as an Olmsted garden, designed well and survived 100 years of still good design and beautiful trees that were planted in the right place. And so I was comfortable in large landscapes, and I still am. And that's mostly what I do is new construction and large landscapes. So I was on the board there for 10 years, and then I started getting more involved, and more people started hiring me, and I got better at what I do. And so I stopped being on the board there. Eventually, I joined the board at the Bloedel Reserve, which I still am on as a advisory committee member. I served 10 years there. And I loved creating landscapes for people, hopefully that they would be legacy gardens, 10 acres, 8 acres, 5 acres, a lot of 1 acres, which when people build new homes and they have large properties and they do conservation easements, they hope that they keep that property alive and for many, many years to come. And I hope so too, when I put all that energy into it. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of work. People say, how do you build such huge landscapes? And basically it's one part at a time, like one plant at a time. You hear that? Well, you break it down into pieces, but it's basically the same concept, the same formula, whether it's a little garden or a 10-acre garden. It's the same thing. You do everything at the same time. So that's sort of how I got into it. And I love it when people text me in the evening and they're sitting outside and they're having a glass of wine and they'll text me and say, we love our garden. And it reminds me, it makes it all worth it when you can improve someone's life and for their children or their family or mobility or for whatever their reasons are, they wanted modifications done to their garden. And I get to meet some really interesting people, really fun people, and gardening people are the best. I just love it.
Jay Sifford is another frequent contributor, and he designs gardens in North Carolina. I found it interesting that Jay is also self-taught, and his path to horticulture was a little bit different than Stacie's. So here's how Jay got into the world of horticulture.
I am totally self-taught. I think I've read a lot, obviously, and I have some mentors that I think is a really important thing to have. But I think past a certain point, you either have an eye for design or you don't. And I'm blessed or cursed. I tend to think 80% of the time it's a blessing that I do have that eye for design. The 20% when it's not is I'm lying awake at 3 o'clock in the morning designing in my head. It's not good then. I'm supposed to be sleeping at 3.
I bet that happens to everyone, though, right? So if someone was just starting out and said, I want to be like Jay Sifford when I grow up, would you recommend a similar, self-taught approach? Or do you think there's value in education, going to school for this type of thing? What do you think?
If somebody wants to be just like Jay Sifford, that's a really scary thing. I don't know that the world can handle two of me. But I think education is obviously good. I decided a long time ago I didn't want to be a landscape architect, because most of those that I know end up designing parking lots and drainage systems, and that wasn't what I wanted to do. But there are some really good courses, especially in England, and I think you can access those online, sign up and pay the tuition for those. And looking back on it, that's probably what I would do if I were starting out today. But I think mentoring, as I said before, is so important. So it would be really good for somebody who's just kind of getting into the business to find somebody that really clicks with their style and their personality, and just suck up to them and learn all you can from them. And that's probably the best way to get started. And of course, reading and attending seminars and symposiums, reading fine gardening magazines, always good too. A lot of things you can do besides go to school. But I think I would do one of those online courses if I had to do it over again.
Excellent. I imagine people must tell you all the time that being a full-time gardening designer is their dream job, but I'm guessing it's not as glamorous as they imagine. What does a typical workday look like for you?
Well, last time I thought it was glamorous was when I was stepping back to look at a design and didn't realize that there was a lake bank right there, and fell backwards into a whole lot of mud. So that was one of my more glamorous moments as of late. But getting back to my normal work day, I do have a crew of 6 people, which I couldn't work without them. But sometimes the running of the business part gets me down a little bit. So I wake up at 6, I do my emails, and then I usually do my site visits between 8 and 8:30 for as long as I need to. And then I have my appointments with potential clients. And hopefully there's a little bit of time a day where I can squeeze in some design work, because that's what people hire me to do. Yeah.
Jay also collects modern art, and he described how art and even pop culture and some surprising pop culture references can inspire transcendent garden designs.
I collect contemporary and abstract art. And if you think about abstract paintings, usually they're sort of big blocks or swaths of bright colors. And so I think that really did influence my style for garden design. I'm basically a block planter as opposed to a matrix planter. I'll tell you the difference. Block planting is when you plant a big group of one thing, or maybe you blur the lines a little bit with a second type of plant. Matrix planting, you start from the bottom and you have a ground layer of sedges usually, and then you work up. So it's not quite as neat and refined as block planting can be. Block planting could be compared to like a Mondrian painting, or if you're my age and used to watch the Partridge Family when you were little, block planting can look like the Partridge Family bus. So you might want to blur those lines a little bit. But I think my art has influenced that style that I have. And also there's just something about living with art, because it's almost like that you have a part of the soul of the artist. Which is kind of cool. And I do believe in muses in a general way. And so when you surround yourself with inspiration, when you surround yourself with creativity, it kind of rubs off. It can't help it rubbing off on you.
I imagine that is the same for a client that is living with one of your designs too. They have a little piece of your soul, and it maybe rubs off on them.
I think so, especially the other photo I sent you with the glass that we might talk about later.
Yeah. So where can people find inspiration to create a unique garden?
Well, I love the word inspiration. I was thinking about this yesterday. Basically inspiration means to breathe into. So if you think about some gardens are just a collection of plants. There's no soul, there's no life. They're sort of static instead of dynamic. So when you're inspired and you're breathing life, you're breathing your personality into that space. It really animates the space, gives it its own personality, and then the space kind of comes alive. I think, you can get inspiration from any place. I've been walking down a sidewalk and I've seen a dandelion come up through a crack, and I'm like, I need to build a crevice garden, that kind of thing. So really inspiration is everywhere. In my old garden, I noticed how the shafts of sunlight kind of pierced the forest canopy and would shine on the ground in certain patterns. So I created a whole garden. I called it my light garden, and I used chartreuse colored plants in the shade to basically mimic the shafts of light coming through the forest canopy. So in that case, that light inspired me to create something that was sort of an illusion. Looking at tree bark, looking at cakes in the restaurant. There's so many places you can really find inspiration. And I think another point to be made about that is that when you're breathing life, you're breathing yourself, that inspiration into your garden, you need to take your own personality into account. I wrote a series of articles years ago for a website on finding your garden personality. And I talked about the extrovert, the philosopher, the artist, the traveler, and there were some more in addition to that. But I think if you are an extrovert, you're going to probably want party time going in your garden, and you'll use bright colors, that sort of thing. If you're a philosopher, your garden is probably going to be a little bit more minimalistic. You will kind of concentrate on different shapes and forms, how they interact with each other. So there are a lot of things that you can interject in your garden with design in mind to really make that garden your own, to breathe your own inspiration into that. You can get inspiration from movies. Actually, I have a talk I developed called The Power of the Line. And you know how I learned so much about how to use lines and shapes and forms properly in a garden is that I studied the Batmobile from the different movies. The first Batman movie came out in 1940, and it was a Cadillac. The Batmobile was. It looked like sort of a gangster car. And then in the 60s, with the whimsical version on TV, it was a kind of a whimsical looking Batmobile. But in the 90s and 2000s, the movies became darker. And so the shapes of the cars became much more angular and more aggressive. So, I learned a lot about garden design from studying the Batmobile, which sort of surprises people sometimes. And then the other movie that I mentioned in the article on my mountain garden was Mary Poppins. And to me, I had a pivotal point in my design career and my personal life. About 15 years ago, I was sitting there on a Saturday night with a bottle of wine, watching Mary Poppins. That's what you do, right? When you're bored on a Saturday. And the part of the movie where Jane and Michael and Mary and Bert jumped into the sidewalk chalk painting and were immersed in an animated world full of really loud sounds and bright primary colors, dancing penguins, carousel horses coming off the carousel to join in a fox hunt. I thought, wow, that is what a garden should be. A place totally immersed, a totally magical place, a place that really has little resemblance to the outside world. And so that kind of became my mission and my goal and my purpose from that point is to design Mary Poppins gardens. And when I succeed in doing that, Mary had this tape measure, and it said Mary Poppins practically perfect in every way. And so I think that if you can design that magical, immersive space full of inspiration, then your garden truly can be practically perfect in every way, just like Mary.
In episode 158, I talked with Irvin Etienne, and he's a good friend, a very talented horticulturist and designer who grew up on a farm in southern Indiana. Irvin was one of 11 children, so as you can imagine, a home garden was very important for keeping all of those kids fed. But his mother always had a row of flowers in the garden, and that might have been what gave Irvin his start in getting into the world of gardening and growing things. Here's how Irvin found his way into public horticulture, which is where he is now.
I first went to school right out of college, right out of high school, and I didn't turn out so good. I was like the most naive 18-year-old that was ever birthed. But anyway, so I quit college and I worked other jobs for almost 10 years before I went back. And my original major was animal sciences, because I'm into the animal thing. But when I got ready to go back, I was into the gardening by then, doing a lot of gardening at home and everything, which was a real advantage when I got to college full time. But when I was deciding on what to do, to be perfectly honest about it all, it was like, as a gay man, where did I want to be? Did I want to be in a feedlot in Nebraska? Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe today, but not in the 80s, certainly. And so it was like, okay, I'll go towards horticulture. And I chose the public horticulture route. You can get into public horticulture from any route of horticulture. It's not required to have a public horticulture degree, and not very many places offer that anymore even. But first semester woody plant course, it was like feeding candy to a child. I could not get enough of it. And because I had the experience coming in late, well, I knew what a lilac was. So when we had 3 lilacs, I knew that they were lilacs. So all I had to do was figure out which of the 3 I was looking at. Same way, with a lot of the trees and shrubs that way. So it was a real advantage to come in as a 28-year-old instead of an 18-year-old. It worked out really well for me. And from there, it's just landing at the right place at the right time, probably. And the only other thing I could say, if people are thinking about going into it, internships, and try different kinds of gardening. Because I'll tell you right now, public horticulture at Newfields compared to public horticulture at a zoo, very different things. Very different people, very different animals. And I did an internship at a zoo. It was great. And I thought I would do zoo horticulture at one point. But that's not the way, life leads you down many paths. You never know which one is going to be the one you stay on. So,
in addition to his public garden work that Irvin does at Newfields in Indianapolis, he is also an avid home gardener. And I have seen both of his home gardens now, and they are spectacular. This clip will give you a little bit of an idea of what his home garden is like. Let's talk about your home garden.
Okay.
When I first met you, we were shooting photos for an article on bulbs and containers, which I think was the first time you and I have worked together.
Yes, it was.
And I will drop a link to that awesome article in our show notes so people can read it. But after that photo shoot, you had to go back to work, and you just gave me your address so I could go see your home garden.
Oh, uh-huh.
And it was very clear as soon as I pulled up which house on that block. I didn't need the street address because I could tell the one with the ginormous banana plants out front, that was Irvin's.
Yeah.
Could you describe that garden, that Indianapolis garden, for the folks at home? And I will put some of the photos that I took into the show notes as well.
Okay. Well, it was a little 1885 house, decent sized lot, really, to be so close to downtown. The back garden, especially, was a nice long area there. It had lawn and a couple crab apples in the front, a couple clumps of, maybe a clump or two of lycores still alive, some climbing roses that were actually the rootstock of tea roses, And that was about it in the garden, I think. And within a few years, I had no turf left or anything else. And it was gardened from front sidewalk to back alley and from side to side, completely chock full of plants. And it was fun. I got to experiment a lot. I I had a privacy fence in the back because I wanted privacy. It's hard to live with people on top of you all the time sometimes. I put that privacy fence up, and within a year or so, the neighbors put a deck off the back of their yard, and they could see right over the top of the fence into my yard.
They didn't want to miss out.
They did. Those folks did enjoy the garden a lot and everything. But anyway, it was just, again, all kinds of woodies, perennials, lots of tropicals, of course. And because I was close to downtown, and I think the fence helped as well, Zone 7 plants were coming through for me on frequently almost, and an occasional Zone 8 I could get through. It was a great place to experiment with hardiness zones because it was so protected. I had lots of spots I could experiment with and everything. It was a crappy little house, trust me. It was oh my God. In truth, it was a disaster that shouldn't have been purchased, but it worked out well.
In episode 162, I talk with Jared Barnes, who is frequent contributor of science articles for us. He is an associate professor of horticulture at the Stephen F. Austin State University in Nacogdoches, Texas. And he got his start in gardening very, very young. Here's how Jared got into the world of plants.
So there's a photograph of me. I'm 4 or 5 years old, and I'm out hoeing corn and tomatoes. And I've got the biggest smile on my face ever because I have loved plants since a very young age. I've always loved the natural sciences, weather, geology, looking at the stars from a very young age. But, plants was definitely a seminal moment for me as a young person because, you could put a seed in the ground, watch it grow, and then harvest something. And one of the people who was very influential on this was my great-grandfather, E.E. Conley. My parents supported me as well, too, but they both worked days. And so we would go up to my grandmother's house, and her dad, E.E. Conley, he and I would go out and work in his vegetable garden together. And so he would till, and I would follow behind, raking out our footsteps, as like a 6-7-year-old. And that was just, cherished moments in the summertime. So he started me a little garden plot, and so I started growing my own tomatoes and growing on sunflowers and stuff, etc. And when I was 13, he passed away. And so that left a hole in my life, and sort of this source of knowledge and wisdom about how to grow plants was gone. And so I started turning to books. I started buying books, and the internet was a new thing. So I started getting on reading about companion planting and herbs and everything else. And when I was 14, my mom mentioned that there was a local master gardener group starting up. And so I joined. I just turned 15 whenever I joined, but my mom had to drive me because of the fact that I didn't have a driver's license, and my dad worked afternoon shift at Goodyear. And so from there, I learned about you could have a career in horticulture and have people point me in the direction of studying, environmental science at my undergrad, University of Tennessee at Martin. They didn't have a horticulture program, so I did botany there. And then eventually on to PhD and master's at NC State in Raleigh, North Carolina. So that's my life in 2 minutes.
And you knew going into college that you wanted to study plants.
I did, yeah. It's funny. I went in to get advised by my college professor, and he says, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to get a PhD so that I can teach people about plants. And he was like, okay. I think part of that is that I'd gone to some of these garden shows, and I had seen Alan Armitage. I went and saw Alan Armitage in Nashville and bought every book he had. And I asked him, I was like, what do I do to do this? Because you're up in front of a group of people sharing your knowledge about plants, and that just looks like the bee's knees to me. And, he said, well, if you find a graduate program and, pursue that, I think that that's something you could really look into. And so that was kind of the direction that I took. And my parents, too, were encouraging me. They saw that I had this passion for sharing knowledge, that, a lot of my friends and stuff kid around that I'm kind of this, encyclopedia of information that I can pull out on a whim. So I think I just played to my strengths and played to the gifts and talents that I have.
You did, I understand, an internship, I believe it was between undergrad and graduate school at the Scott Arboretum at Swarthmore
That's
College. Can you
correct. Yeah.
tell us a little bit about that experience?
That was fantastic. I got to work with Andrew Bunting up there, who, a lot of people in the horticulture world know him from Magnolias. And of course, he's now the vice president of horticulture at the PHS, Pennsylvania Horticultural Society. And so that summer was wonderful because what it did is it really showed me the sort of upper echelon of horticulture, because growing up in Tennessee, I was trying to figure out how to grow these things, just understand it. And then it's almost like going to Pennsylvania and having that internship was, just like the sort of the craft of people who have been doing it for so long and trying to figure out how to do it the best way possible. And that's something that I've always pursued in my life, is trying to figure out if there's a way of doing something, what's the best way. And so, whether it's weeding or fertilizing or taking care of plants, when to cut them back, how to manage them, the potting. One of the things we were responsible for as interns there were the containers. And so, how do you water it? How do you edit a container? That was a novel concept to me. How do you take a container that maybe has some yellowing leaves, brown leaves, things that are starting to look a little awry, and then go in and remove those to freshen it up. So definitely going up there. And then the other thing too that was a great blessing with that was all the connections I made, because, I was basically input into, as people call it, the garden mecca of the United States, because there's just so many great gardens up there, like Chanticleer and Longwood. And on the weekends, I took advantage of that. I went to every garden I could potentially find while I was in that area. And so it was definitely a deep dive, a 2-month deep dive into the horticulture that, Brandywine, River Valley area.
Dr. Jared and his students have created a botanical garden on the university campus. It's called the Plantery. And so I asked him about cross-pollination between the Plantery and the horticulture program and the rest of the university community as a whole. So here's what Dr. Jared had to say about that.
Well, that's a great question. So here on campus, I teach an intro horticulture class, and it's called Cultivating Plants. Again, instead of calling it horticulture, intro to horticulture, we just called it Cultivating Plants, because we're trying to show people what plants are. I teach the class, and first or second day, I'll ask who's never heard of the word horticulture, and 5 to 10% of the hands in the class go up. But the reason I bring up that class, talking about the cross-pollination, is that class is for majors and non-majors. And so I have students who take the class who are business majors, art majors, sports majors, criminal justice majors. I mean, really across the board on campus. And what's so cool is that, they come in with interesting questions. They come in with interesting ideas. Some of them have never grown a plant before, or they've never sown a seed before. I mean, think about that, Carol. Like, I have students coming into my class who have never sown a seed in their entire life. And you'll hear it every semester, oh, this plant's going to die. And then they get it through the entire semester and they've kept it alive. And they're just like, holy cow, I didn't know this was even possible, that I could do this. And of course, we're helping them. But, still, nevertheless, it is a lot of fun to engage with them and see that. The other thing, too, is that, I have students that work with me in the Plantery as well. And so I've had students that are organizational business majors, animal science majors, forestry majors, environmental science, but math majors, all across the board. And so bringing these fresh ideas into horticulture, sort of grafting to different groups of people, has really helped us out, because suddenly you'll have somebody who's more business minded, and so they can help us out with building our marketing. We have somebody else who really knows a lot about woodworking, so they can help us build signage. And to me, that's the beautiful thing about horticulture, is that we've got to figure out ways to bridge ourselves to other groups of people so that we can help grow plants and help to connect that love of horticulture with others.
So that's our little trip down memory lane with the fine gardening interviews that we've been doing over the past year and a half or so. I hope you've enjoyed them. If you would like to hear more from any of these contributors, I will drop links to the full episodes in the show notes. You can also see photos of some of the things that folks are talking about and find other episodes. This is episode 178. So there are plenty of episodes to binge if you're just joining us now. And have a great week. And I hope that you are going to do some gardening this spring.